Thanks so much. I will offer you something of a statement which is drawn very intensively from the place where I live and work, which I think is important because we've been having conversations last night about linking Malta up to the African continent. It seems so close but so far right now. And if I ever come back, I'll talk about islands and literal cities and ways of thinking Malta into and out of the Indian Ocean. That's what I'm going to do if there's ever another chance. But Achille and I have arrived here, we've never been here, don't know what you guys are thinking about, so all we can possibly do is tell you what we're thinking about. And I'm going to begin, I'm going to end with 3 images which speak to me very loudly to the theme of tonight. And I hope it's helpful and interesting to you. Right, so at the University of Cape Town in 2016, student protesters burned works of art, torn down from their long-established positions on university walls. A large bonfire was made in front of the empty plinth that had held, until he was forcibly removed, the statue of Cecil John Rhodes. Among the paintings burned were portraits of patrons of the university, largely white, over the previous decades. Also burned were works of black resistance art, collateral damage in a furious attempt to undo what these earlier resistance works could not, the new exclusions of the post-apartheid order, the new old status quo. The fires that burned at the University of Cape Town, UCT as we call it that day, were part of a new wave of critique over the last 3 years in South Africa and at universities elsewhere around the world. The rising wave has been raw, confrontational, and interested in the politics of acceleration, breaking back on the shoreline of the present in the midst of growing inequality and the failures of the left to count the forces of a consolidating neoliberalism, to counter those forces. It has risen on a tide of anger, including towards art itself, and it has sought to ignite what Adorno would have called the potent politics of negation, fueled not only by a critique of capitalism and class relations, but of legacies of colonialism and racism. It is the shock of the new old, where what was taken to be by some to be the past is not past, but is coeval with the present. The politics of acceleration is a speeding up of a system or a form, exacerbating its velocities, amplifying its contradictions, to try to implode it from within. This mode of escalation, as it has been deployed by young 21st century South African university students, has drawn tactically on what Matthias Pauwels, writing from Pretoria, the old capital of apartheid in South Africa, has suggestively called critical philistinism, the deliberate and explicit rejection of more mediated and so-called more complex or sublimated approaches to art, more apparently, he writes, prudent and productive acts of cultural decolonization. Satire, parody, revisionism, rereading, reappropriation, all of which risk affirming the order they set out to critique, as he has put it. And so we return in repetition, but also in 21st century late capitalist difference, to Adorno and the Frankfurt School, that defining moment of the project of critique, as we've come to know it, since the closing decades of the 20th century. We return not least, Pauwels points out, to Adorno's notion of the hatred of art. That is, of art's inability to realize its promise of happiness in the face of social inequality and its legacies of racism, the transformation of which art can contribute very little to. According to this deeper hatred of art, success in the case of the UCT art fire is equated with removal, the removal of art altogether from a wall by fire. I want to insist on the historical significance across time of such a critique, even as I will offer and complicate it with a different mode of critique, or at least a different manner of what Rosie Bray-Dotty has called rethinking thinking towards the end of my remarks this evening. Even as we might speculate on whether the art of the empty wall, perhaps what Adorno referred to in passing as non-art, although he did not elaborate, is to be taken as an act of radical acknowledgement or a form of defeat, or both at the same time, we can appreciate a politics of velocity and amplification, both old and new, attempting to implode from within a system that is perceived to be both broken and all-pervasive, late capitalist, neoliberal, risingly authoritarian, thriving on new old forms of racism all over again. I am reminded of what Leclau and Mouffe once referred to in another context as wild antagonisms. In our case in South Africa now, wild antagonism to the slow constitutionalism and painstaking reconciliation of the immediate post-apartheid years, as well as to even progressive accounts of resublimation, which want to teach us to think better and see better. Recently, one of South Africa's most talented photographers, Mikhail Dubofsky, exhibited a series of photographs that he had smashed. Retinal Shift, the series he smashed and then exhibited, included high-resolution images of the artist's left and right retinas, self-portraits of the eye, made with the help of an optometrist. I was fascinated by this encounter, says Dubofsky. At the moment that my retinas, my essential organs of seeing, were photographed, I was blinded by the apparatus that made the images. So, it's a self-portrait of myself, the photographer, at a moment I could not see. Dubofsky moves from a figuration of what he could not see, implicitly what he could not see as a white South African, to a smashing of his elegant allegorical study. By 2016, that was in 2012, by 2016 he moves on to a complete withdrawal from the practice of photography as such, conscious of, quote, how fraught its history is. After smashing Retinal Shift, he says in a recent interview, I've come out completely from the world of making photographs. I've lost faith in photography, or at least I've lost interest in practicing it myself. Smashing and burning his way out, leaving us with an empty wall. And so, even as we haunted by the empty wall, we confront and take on board one mode in which the critique of the university, especially in the humanities, has cast itself, a negative dialectics, the power of terminal crisis, the accelerationist politics of Zizek, amongst others. We may recall here Nietzsche's view that critical thought needs negativity. In an age of accelerationist politics, some forms of black critical thought, often referred to as Afro-pessimist, assume newly proto-global dimensions mapped across continental corridors, pitted against rising inequality again and ongoing forms of exclusion, pitted too against earlier assertions of diasporic difference. Middle passage epistemologies which dispute now or hold aside in a world of accelerationist politics, anti-blackness, what my colleague Victoria Collis-Buthelezi has called the contributions of smaller places and their potential for making possible larger frameworks of solidarity. A politics of acceleration based around a critique anti-blackness which refuses diasporic difference any longer. A negative dialectics implies that the crises at universities in South Africa have played out, especially in the humanities, not only because the humanities enable certain forms of critique, but because the humanities attract the largest number of poor, often black students, while also, especially in recent times, being the most undervalued and dispensable part of the university. Under such conditions, acts of destruction need to be read not only as symptoms of the collapse of the public university, but also as a form of cultural analysis born out of the exigencies of catastrophe, a form of reimagining, then. We might think in terms, then, of what I am here calling the redistributed university. I make use of the term in two different senses. First, in the sense of the call for a politics of reparation and change, an insistence, that is, on a renewed engagement with who occupies university structures and how, and on whose behalf and to what ends, on a changed curriculum which draws much more fully on rich and often underrepresented traditions of black thought. It refers to, amongst other issues, to the taking down of statues that have outlasted their time, archiving them if necessary, so we can study their visual and political legacies. In Senegal, a rainstorm knocked over the statue recently of a former colonial leader. French governor of Senegal in the 1800s. Despite protests, the Ministry of Culture in Senegal reinstalled the statue, claiming that the city of Saint Louis is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and thus the statue was part of Senegal's heritage. In Charlottesville, white supremacists protested, as we know, against the decision by the city to take down the statue of General Lee, a slave-owning warlord during the US Civil War. My university has no statues to take down, though there's a public outcry against putting up a statue of Jacob Zuma somewhere off campus. The redistributed university in this sense, this first sense that I'm using it tonight, calls for a redistributive system that would imply in our context, variously, what Achille has called, in a slightly different context, the becoming black of the world, also in some iterations, the becoming African of the world, or to return to an earlier iteration, which we'll talk about tomorrow, a contention in a different frame, the becoming south of the world. Here we read for form as reparation, reparatory form, calls for fee decreases or free education, and for the insourcing of workers, operate along these redistributive logics deeply invested in social justice. At my university, Wits University, by early 2017, all workers had been insourced, earning more decent salaries, with the option to send their children to Wits. This has produced a much poorer university, but one in which the price of a more just community has been paid. And then I suggest we must turn our attention to a university redistributed in a second different sense, complicating the picture in a new way. Let me pose it in the form of a series of questions. Might it be that debates about how universities can make their walls more porous? Have you noticed there are conferences these days about the university, and people debate what's inside, what's outside, about what constitutes their inside and their outside, and about who their publics are, and about the figure of activist scholars who straddle the harsh boundaries of university and society. Have these debates been superseded at some level already by the fact that knowledge as such is being driven increasingly by extra-institutional formations, less circumscribed by institutions and disciplines, that knowledge is less bounded, unmoored from the university, redistributed, uncontainable within its walls, and easily searchable? In a number of city contexts I know well, fully fledged academic institutes are emerging outside of universities, doing intellectual work while avoiding university bureaucracies and the demands to teach large undergraduate cohorts. This may be, or perhaps not, where the universities of the South are diverging most strongly and perhaps most vulnerably too from the universities of the North. I'm almost sure that the landscape is more messy than a North-South picture presents and implies in any case. For several decades since the 1980s, many of the strongest African scholars and intellectuals sought work as academics outside of the African continent and its increasingly broken universities. By that decade, many universities, there are 800 universities on the continent of Africa, had been decolonized but were in debt to the IMF and the World Bank, were fragile and unable to emerge as new kinds of redistributed institutions. Student bursaries didn't exist, staff salaries were cut. Now, in various degrees, thanks to anti-immigration policies in Euro-America and worsening forms of authoritarianism and homeland security, and because some excellent scholarship is emanating from young Africa-based scholars, African intellectuals seem keener to re-inhabit a redistributed African knowledge terrain in the sense of social justice formations as well as city-based institutes crafted outside of the universities, in Maputo, in Lusaka, in Accra, in Johannesburg. More ambiguously, of Africa's 800 universities, more will soon be private than public, with China attending increasingly to Africa's educational needs. In order to compete globally, Africa's higher education market will have to include a large contingent of private universities, citadels, in a broader public university landscape. All of this asks that we contest and argue what the university is for and how it is to be defended. Only adding to the complexity of a redistributed university humanities in both senses that I've used the term above is the rising power of algorithmic reason. We've been talking about it this evening, with its new orders of abstraction and its avowedly post-human nodes of analysis and comprehension. Does this now reduce the humanities and its modes of critique at some level to an increasingly marginal place in the understanding of what is propelling the contemporary in its capacity to write the histories of the present? Some accelerationist theorists are arguing that a humanities project of critique of the status quo and or a revived project of the left in general should be versing itself in mathematics and data analysis, emerging in a form of abductive logic, developing a new emancipatory politics of abstraction, interrupting and intervening in algorithmic data and turning it towards social justice ends. And how does this version of what the left must do square with forms of protest, often deployed by students? Is the redistributed university then in ruins? Or, to ask a Rosie Braidotti-inflected question, is it in a state of affirmative proliferation? If it is now possible to assemble knowledge differently, how best can we learn to think? What is it about a university that we still need? Is it long-form reading and writing? Is one answer among many that the university might be the only kind of institution which can generate a direct, theoretically and politically informed engagement with acts of destruction, can do the work of writing a history of radical acts of anger, of a southern form of anger towards art, of a critical philistinism, while also being fully alive to the problem and the possibility of its own destruction? Is it the only institution that can do that? If the university of an earlier era is in ruins, then is it so, as Benjamin and others have reminded us, that ruins are, or at least can be, productive? That ruins can produce new combinations of things as they once were and have ceased to be, and therefore possibilities of other forms of becoming. I think that these questions are presenting themselves particularly starkly in countries of the South, in India, South Africa and Brazil. But I would be interested in hearing from this audience tonight how these dynamics and logics are playing out in the university context you generally inhabit and reflect on. One of the viable questions put to decolonization movements in South African universities and elsewhere has been, well, what theories of new knowledge do they subscribe to, if any? An attendant concern expressed by some has been how to prevent the establishment of a new closed system of thinking turned in on itself, not receptive enough to novelty. More pejoratively, some will ask, what is the use of doing the rich and painstaking work of rewriting a curriculum when students in the humanities read 3 texts per course per semester in literature departments because they can't finish novels anymore? But then it could be argued in relation to what I've said above, that knowledge is more redistributed than actual literary text on a curriculum these days. The slower work of the university in the production of theories of knowledge, a process of thinking, has to be at the heart of these debates about the university and knowledge futures, or else it's not worth having them. If we proliferate rather than narrow our forms of knowledge and knowledge bases, we have to turn our attention to a third plane of redistribution, that of the planetary. One of the challenges of the digital humanities and the environmental humanities, but most especially of the two taken together, is that we can no longer just assume the human to be the ground of our analysis. The human, but here the right to be human, has always been contested, as feminists and black studies scholars have pointed out. Histories of racism, and within them histories of slavery, stand center ground in the struggle for the human, though they've often been marginalized in the most outrageous ways. Now we ask as humanities scholars to take on and think with, in addition to the competencies we already have, knowledges of the more than human, the other than human. There's a clear case before us in the age of computational capacities that we have to deal with post-human formations, even though some of you rigorously contested that this afternoon. That we must compose what Braidotti, who I'm attached to at present, has called a different plane of encounters with a set of assemblages that inhabit but are not limited to the human. Such acts of composition complicate, if they do not replace matters of ontology, in which the so-called liberal subject has been taken to be the subject of democracy, and Achille will talk about that tomorrow night and has written about it in interesting ways already. For those of us in the southern part of the world, we need to learn to remember, as scholars like Harry Garuba and others have reminded us, that deeply embedded in what it has meant to be African, especially in conditions of scarcity and finitude, and what has been misread by northern theorists as animism, has been the turn to the vitalities of things, plants, and animals. There's a wonderful piece that I love. It's my favorite academic piece at the moment, called My Plants Are My Lovers. And it's situated in a small town in Mozambique called Inhambane, and it's written about by a multi-species anthropologist called Judy Archambault. And in conditions of excessive commodification of intimacy, where men can't afford women anymore, gardeners turn to their love of plants to reimagine intimacy. Their plants become their lovers in a literal and metaphorical sense. This is an ideal example of multi-species ethnography as it applies to poor communities in Africa. It's not limited to the upper echelons of the avant-garde. My Plants Are My Lovers is the way in which the templates of plants help humans figure out how to love each other again, outside of commodification, in the last frontier of capitalism. An elaboration of a multiplicity of vital beings, together with rethinking digital technologies, remake African subjectivities of the present. And so it is that we begin to revisit the terms of our critique. Achille, who I read all the time, I enjoy thinking with, I have worked with for 15 years, and who's been extraordinarily prolific in the last 10 years. It's hard to avoid you. In his essay on necropolitics, rethinks Foucault, thinks with Foucault, rethinks biopolitics, writing that the notion of biopower is insufficient to account for contemporary forms of the subjugation of life to the power of death, and the creation of death worlds, new and unique forms of social existence, in which vast populations are subject to conditions of life conferring upon them the status of the living dead. But here I'm going to disagree with Achille. I'm going to go for another notion of necropolitics as a mode of fictionalization that allows us to imagine another space of social life. I draw this notion of fictionalization from scholars who are working, interestingly, on Fukushima, Japan, are thinking about the triple catastrophe of the tsunami, which became the earthquake, or the other way around, which became the nuclear explosion. Another, a planetary space of the social that we are thrust into in ways that I'll describe. Here, in this politicized space of fictionalization, we open onto a planetary cartography of what Christophe Tourny has referred to as a radical austerity to the human, and the impossibility of access to exteriority of any sort. Such a form of the necropolitical is learning to live with worlds that die, and is quite contrary to Ulrich Beck's global risk society, the business of predicting the future in order to avoid catastrophe. It also resists the at times extraordinarily hyper-masculine hyperbole of some versions of necropolitics, catastrophe thinking. What emerges here is a different form of critique, taking the form of an affirmative ethics, born precisely from an understanding of worlds that die. Reading more and more closely, the ground of our experience comes strongly from feminist epistemologies, embedded and embodied ways that women scholars in particular have long taught us to think with. That Tourny and his colleague Mitsushiro Yoshimoto are writing out of a context of nuclear radiation, Fukushima, Japan, is telling. Part of the invocation of the planetary as necropolitical draws on the floating atmospheres of nuclear radiation, which radically disturb our accustomed understandings of space and time. Here I recall Nobel Prize winner Svetlana Alexievich, the first non-fiction book to win the Nobel Prize for a long time. I was saying this morning that in South Africa now, fiction is receding and non-fiction is rising in terms of thinking the present, the real, what is before us. She writes a book called Voices from a word I still can't pronounce, Chernobyl, the oral history of a nuclear disaster. And she quotes from interviewees. Somebody says, we wanted to hide from the atom as if we were hiding from shrapnel. But the atom is everywhere. We breathe radiation, we eat it. It is perhaps easier in the temporal mode of the shock of the new old to think with nuclear radiation, especially since Trump is forcing us to revisit it. Relegated, we thought, to the planetary past, than with the even more hyper-objective scale, to use Tim Morton, of climate change. If nuclear time is becoming significant again in our new world order, we must renew our understanding and continue to place centrally in our analyses, as Saidiya Hartman and Toni Morrison have shown us for a very long time, the experiences and reflections of those whose entire worlds have ended or died before, destroyed by racism, slavery, patriarchy, and who have learned to live again, to persist in being, to draw on a wonderful phrase from Jane Bennett, who wrote a book called Vibrant Matter. The notion of the unthought belongs to Hartman and others, placing capitalism's imbrication with the slave plantation central to a critical rethinking of a political and philosophical position in which we find ourselves, to draw on Rosie Braidotti, who I'm thinking with, together but not the same. Planetary entanglement takes the form of being in this together but not as one. She calls for a pragmatic ethics and a materialist paradigm, which calls on us to live up to the intensities of life, worthy of all that happens to us. So we're left with two forms of critique, a negative dialectics or an affirmative ethics. Both are ways of honoring alternative sources of knowledge. Both draw on feminist epistemologies and anti-racist thought. Both seek to draw in multitudes of the missing. Braidotti talks about missing peoples. Latour talks about the missing in another vein, I don't remember now. The missing, both human and non-human, rendered invisible by history and theory. Both respect structural differences people face and the inequalities that inhabit our present. While we inhabit both versions of critique, or we could, depending on where we live and where our sensibilities lie, and deepest and strongest. I am drawn for now to the second version of critique, though I started with the first, which calls for more theory, not less, for more thinking about thinking, as we quote Rosie Braidotti, labour towards a new kind of subject, knowing that we're not the same, and in which the humanities would then necessarily become a core curriculum in any university of and for the planet, instead of marginalized and abandoned. If one of the jobs of the humanities is to imagine social structures that can accommodate emergent realities, then they are now situated at the center of our survival. What does it help if scientists who understand planetary systems tell us that the Earth as we've known it no longer exists, if we can't translate that into how to constitute a shared world? So we've been talking today, using Braidotti, on critical post-human knowledges, driven by a useful distinction Deleuze made between royal and minor sciences. We've been thinking about how minor knowledges, underfunded, marginalized in universities, can act as ethically transformative and politically empowering. We've talked a little bit, no we didn't in fact, we never got to Manuel de Landa, a wonderful theorist who elaborates on the virtual becoming of minor sciences. So we can think about the post-human as existing in an advanced but brutal landscape in which we need a proliferation of theory and a new trust in the imagination and forms of fictionalization, as I've mentioned earlier. We can emphasize the inhuman in the post-human. We can think about the liquid grave of the Mediterranean, containing the bodies of people who are not meant to stay and are never allowed to arrive. Non-sovereign peoples, as we discussed this morning, confound to the outer sovereign space of the sea. Such a grounding in experience and materiality enables us. It doesn't distract us from taking power relations seriously, but in a transformative manner. We can place this work richly in conversation with the work of Sylvia Wynter, who's the neglected woman theorist of Black critical thought. Wynter draws from a radical anti-colonial tradition. She argues that the human is always somewhere a colonial figure, a figure that is always becoming something and whose presence implies a principle of deselection, of deselected peoples. I wonder what we could put together deselected peoples with missing peoples. At stake for Wynter, as for Braidotti, are our orders of knowledge. And this she explores in her long exchange with Catherine McTrick, entitled Unparalleled Catastrophe for Our Species, ? Or To Give Humanness a Different Future. She thinks it's time for an epistemic break from the modes and practices of being human, as we've articulated them, in which we recognize what we actually are, in which we recognize now, drawing on Fanon and Césaire, who we have systematically excised, the world's most marginalized. As we confront what we are, she says, we will confront what capital is. Wynter, towards the end of her reflections, asks what kind of politics we can think of as emerging from those who've been deselected. We can place her deselected peoples, as I've said here, in relation to the missing peoples of Braidotti. Wynter calls, in a manner redolent for my remarks tonight, for the opening of the social. For both theorists, these two women thinking together, the power of terminal crisis produces other ways of thinking what thinking means and opens urgent new forms of ethical engagement for the humanities. Conclusion. For 16 years now, I've worked at a Humanities Institute in Johannesburg, South Africa, known as WISER, for the last 5 as its director. As we struggle, contest, and confront each other and the world we inherit in our seminar room, right inside an African city, year after year, as we reach for the after-apartheid, but recognize how apartheid and all it represents circles back and forces itself on us again, as we try for a politics of entanglement, when there's ample evidence for non-renationality, non-relationality as the only ground we can trust. When we reach with new intensity into the place where we are, and we reach outwards to a planet with a new vulnerability we haven't felt before, as we try to grasp all that we're ceasing to be and all that we're becoming, without nostalgia, as far as possible. I think it's helpful to meet the crises of the humanities and the university with an insistence on proliferation and renewal, to be the thinking thing that they cannot afford to do without. I'm going to finish with 3 images, which we're not going to put on the screen, but are on this little screen, and we're small enough for you to see them. It's gone. Just put in the password, please. Because they really help me to think the emerging project of thought analysis and knowledge redistribution that I'm pursuing tonight. Where is it? I really want you to see that image. It's by a Kenyan artist called Jim Chuchu. He's an openly gay photographer and filmmaker. He lives in Nairobi, where homosexuality is illegal.
So I'll just pass them around.
Sure, or just hold it up. I'm sure everyone can see.
Can you all see this like this?
His photographs imagine a pre-Christian, pre-Islamic Kenya that is, he said in an interview, far removed from the experience of his own generation. Chuchu takes black and white photographs and draws in pencil or watercolor on his original shot, then digitally scans the original photograph and manipulates it. As a gay man, he is rejected by mainstream religions in his country. He says he's interested in discovering spiritual alternatives, exploring histories that predate patriarchal, homophobic, colonial religious systems. Left with the embrace of the present, or the non-embrace of the present, or the ability to take comfort, without the ability to take comfort in the past, he remixes a new past, writes Jen Graves. I'm interested in moves to reshape blackness, a blackness not afraid to exist in another world, he says. And I don't think when we see our skin, we see light. Light associated with black bodies is still a political project in 2015. When his work was shown last year at the Dakar Biennale, the exhibit was shut down for being detrimental to our morality and our laws. I'd like to move to a second image, if you could just find it for me. It's that one, by South Africa's best-known artist, William Kentridge. It's a woodcut of a suited man, much like his protagonist, Soho Eckstein, the megalomaniac mining boss who appears in many of his short films that at least some of you here will know.
It's difficult, I'm sorry, it's difficult to see. Would you mind coming a little closer?
No problem.
Thanks. I don't know anymore.
So the protagonist and narrator of his most famous short films is the mining boss called Soho Eckstein. Now, in this image, Eckstein sports a human head. Sorry, not a human head or a face, but a plant head. One may speculate on the nature of his fate and imagine this to be a commentary in part on, variously, his not quite humanity in the face of the apartheid-inspired dispossession his selfhood and business empire is founded on. We could read it as his unraveling, politically and psychically, away from the safe and stolid container of a strictly human body as his world implodes. Or just perhaps as a form of reinvention of self that begins to take hold as his suitedness comes to mean nothing. The plant is metaphorically, one feels, a signifier of a different kind of growth towards an unknown form of self. Framing this image from an Anthropocenic view, in which the resources of a sustainable planet are at stake and the Earth is vulnerable to human destruction, Eckstein's embodiment of a capitalist ethos that ruins the Earth is now implicated in the continuing possibility of plant life, and newly vulnerable to other life forms, which he shares with what Michel Serres has called the trembling planet. Kentridge's replacement of the central stem of the nervous system, the seat of interiority, or as we were discussing so in such a lively manner this afternoon, consciousness as such, the mind as such, with a plant, opens for us numerous windows of thoughts and analysis in multiple registers from humor to satire, differently inflected suggestion of a reimagined, more than human self, rerouted through plant-like form. And in the final image, please, that one there. This is an image by a South African performance artist called Setembile Msezane.
Just like this.
It's called Chapungu, The Day Rhodes Fell. And I'm not going to say much, because it's so vividly clear. The symbolically rich Zimbabwean bird rises, the more than human body, as Rhodes' statue falls. We may note the arms raised all around Chapunga, holding phones and iPads, remediating the extension of this human figure into a more than human world. But much more interesting, the more than human here is figured not as belonging to a different world, but as living among us. It seems to me, in closing then my last sentence, that in this living statue, we see the radically new, plus a new version of what happened before the shock of the new old. Thank you so much.